Hi, everyone. Welcome into this virtual event space. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds before I kind of begin my introduction spiel as everyone kind of just filters in. Seeing a lot of names I recognize in the attendee list, so thank you so much for being here. My introduction is pretty long, so I am going to get to it now. So like I said, welcome everyone to this Montana Book Festival event. It is an event featuring David Horgan and Deirdre McNamer. For your information, earlier this year, the Montana Book Festival hosted a book launch event for Dee and her latest novel, Aviary, and David was Dee's conversation partner during that event. So now we are turning the tables. Dee will be chatting with David about his new book, Helmi Shadow. So this is, as you well know by now, turning the tables. This event is sponsored by a number of different organizations and businesses, including Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and the Trail 1033. My name is Lauren Corrin. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm zooming in from my office in the Mountain Press Publishing Company building here in Missoula, Montana. I want to say that the Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from the Bitterroot Salish word in Mijutlitko, which means place of the freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Mijutlitko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty, and following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish and other peoples in their attempts to acquire land. Despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tutakan people are still here and still thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. For those of you zooming in from outside Missoula, I encourage you to let us know where you're zooming in from. Go ahead and throw your locations in the chat, okay? Just so we know where our audience is coming in from. A few logistics before Dee and David get to it today. I'd like to invite you as attendees to submit your questions for David and Dee via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll notice that there's both Q&A and a chat. Q&A is for questions. The chat is for conversation. It's for comments. I will be throwing out links in the chat too and other information from the book festival, but I will be monitoring both on the back end of the conversation. I also want to note that if you're interested in purchasing David's book, Helmi Shadow, you can do so through our festival bookseller, Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana, at factandfictionbooks.com. I'll be throwing some links out there from Fact and Fiction, but please be sure to enter MBF at checkout so that 20% of those book sales can come back to the festival, which is really great. So with that said, I'm going to introduce this afternoon's writers. David Horgan is a writer and professional musician. His book of short stories, titled The Golden West Trio +1, received the Miriam Frontier Award from the University of Montana. His stories and essays have appeared in a number of publications, including The New Montana Story, The Best of the West, Portland Review, Quarterly West, Northern Lights, and The Crescent Review. Born and raised in Reno, Nevada, he now lives here in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, David. Oh, there you are. And hi. And Deirdre, or Dee McNamer, is the author of 5 novels, Aviary, Rima in the Weeds, One Sweet Quarrel, My Russian, and Red Rover, which was a winner of the Montana Book Award and was named a Best Book of the Year by Artforum, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. Her essays, short fiction, and reviews have appeared in the New Yorker, Plowshares, the New York Times, and Outside, among other venues. Dee chaired the fiction panel of the National Book Awards in 2011 and was a judge for the 2015 Penn Faulkner Award. She has taught writing at Cornell University, Williams College, Ohio State University, the University of Oregon, the University of Alabama, the University of Montana, and the Bennington Writing Seminars, where she currently teaches in the low residency MFA program. She lives here also in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Dee.
Hello.
Hi, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. So welcome to this book festival event and have fun.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I am sort of going to be the inquisitor here, and David's going to tell me everything that I want to know. Helmi's Shadow is an amazing book. I admire it so much. And as I was going back through it with an eye to what we might talk about today, I was struck again by its heart and its eloquence and its rigor. This time especially, I went, wow, there is a lot of really amazing research in this. Yes, he knew the people somewhat, knew part of their stories, but then I saw in the acknowledge or the citations at the end, 34 books, 5 websites, 2 works of fiction, and 1 movie were singled out by David as sources for filling in the gaps to the extent that he could in this story. So my first question for you is, David, is did it feel daunting at the outset of this to sort of not know what was out there or where you should look? How did you handle this research question, or not a question, but just a task really that I think has just very much added to the texture and richness of the book?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words. And the answer is that it was mostly a really joyful project for me to fill in the gaps, as you say. I knew quite a bit about my mother and my grandmother's general parameters, but there was so much that I didn't know. And I suppose it's typical with a project like this. Once you start looking and digging, you find out a lot more that you didn't know. You didn't know it, and one thing led to another, but and one book led to another. Actually, that list that I show as a bibliography at the end of this book is not even an exhaustive list. Downstairs in this house where I'm sitting is a huge shelf of stuff. I just decided to single out all the sources that were really particularly helpful to me.
David, I'm going to break in just for a second. One person wanted your volume to be increased a little bit. It's having trouble hearing you. Can you turn that up a little?
Okay, I'll do 2 things. I'll sit closer and whoops, I'll scoot it all the way to the top. Whoever you are, let us know if that makes a difference.
All right.
I'll speak up too. Okay. So, yeah, I also got very, very interested in the general subject matter, the general history that forms the background for this story. Some of the locations in particular, I would say particularly the city of Shanghai during the middle decades of the 20th century, the early decades and the middle decades, is an amazing and fascinating place. It still is, Shanghai is still a very fascinating place to this day. And in fact, many of the locations that I refer to in this book, Beth and I were able to find and go to. There's even a photo of myself standing on the street corner where my mother had lived. It's right next to a photo of her standing on that corner in the 1980s, the only time she ever went back. So it was a lot of work, but it was a really rewarding project because I really began to understand the fuller picture of this story, and it gave me the confidence to proceed and try to tell it in the way that I wanted to tell it. It took a long time.
Yeah.
But it was worth it. Well,
it's really sort of an Odyssey kind of story, isn't it? Where it starts during the in Tsarist Russia. These people travel thousands of miles to end up in an enclave where they would be safe as Jews in the early part of the last century. A place that neither of them, the mother or the daughter or anybody else in the family, had been to before. And then the mother and daughter, for those of you who haven't read the book, I might just be telling you things you already know, but the scope of the changes that they went through during their lifetimes is just amazing to me. It was after Horgan, it was Shanghai, it was Kobe, it was, let's see, what was it first? Harbin, and then.
Well, it was Odessa in the.
Odessa, yes.
Then it was Harbin in Manchuria, northern China. Then for many, many years, it was in Shanghai, further down the coast in China. And then it was across the water in Japan, in the city of Kobe.
Yeah.
And
then finally, Reno, Nevada, after the war, where the mother and the daughter lived, and as part of a, quintessentially seeming American 50s family, after all this travel and anguish and close calls, they fetch up there where David grew up, obviously. Okay, so you do the research with something like this. You accumulate facts, you learn when the B-29 bombings were, what it was like, or where the train went that they traveled on from Odessa, facts. But then I think in the best memoirs, somehow those facts are made to live, to come alive, to make the reader feel that they were there. So I'm just going to read really briefly one little section about them being on the train from Odessa to Harbin, because I want to follow up with a question to David. Related to research and how he made this live. And this isn't even one of the more, sort of vivid scenes. This is just straightforward and to me, really tactile. Okay, in the spring of 1906, the train journey from Odessa to Harbin on the Trans-Siberian Railroad took 11 days. Okay, you can find that out in the encyclopedia. But then it goes further. 9-year-old Rachel Cooper, the grandmother, and her family were transplanted to what must have seemed a wilderness. The train, powered by a belching steam engine, chugged across the vast Siberian landscape at 15 miles per hour. They traveled second class with sleeping berths stacked 3 high and no meals provided, so they brought their food with them. Somewhere up ahead, closer to the engine, was a first-class section, including a dining car outfitted with linen and silver, and a separate parlor car equipped with its own grand piano, reserved for well-to-do Russians with financial interests in the newly accessible Far East. Outside the window, as they traveled east, the towns and train stations grew smaller, the distance from the home the Coopers had known greater and greater. With every mile, the horizon seemed to grow more barren and treeless. And so now we have almost, something akin to what you would read in a work of fiction. It's what it looked like. It's sensory data, and the grand piano, the silver. So how did you, and I trust impeccably that these details came from your research, right?
Yeah, it really.
And then it's inhabiting how they must have felt in that environment.
It wasn't that hard to look up details like that. There are various kinds of memoirs and historical tracts that provide you with this sort of information. Sometimes it's overwhelming how much information you get from a work of history. And the job that I felt like I was taking on was gleaning the details that were important to me and useful to me, and then using them in the story. And it's interesting that you would talk about using techniques of fiction, because I was very aware as I was really putting the narrative together that I wanted this to be readable in the way that a beautifully written novel is readable. For instance, your own book, Aviary, which I can cite readily as a perfect example of this, where the language and the details carry you along in a way that provides, like you said, sensory information and very personal information. But I also tried to be accurate to what all the books on my bookshelf told me.
Mm-hmm.
So as a matter of, here's my story over here, here's this pile of information over here, and as I'm moving the story along, I filter in the information that I hope would keep the story going forward in a way that keeps it readable to some, I don't know if this is true for you. As I was plowing along with this, I began to realize that I had an ideal reader in my mind. The ideal reader to me is someone who is interested in a story, interested in the language, how you're telling the story, and is willing to focus on a lot of details, and can become interested in the history as long as it's not overwhelming and serves the story, but will stay interested in both ways, interested in the people in the story and the information that's coming along at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I am finding I'm getting some really gratifying reactions from people. There are a number of people out there who are fitting my image of the ideal reader. They're out there, which is wonderful.
That was actually one of my questions. But now it's been out for a while, and not that long, but long enough that you are getting feedback from many sources, I'm sure. What else do people say? I mean, what do your readers, including your ideal readers, respond to the most energetically, or what moved them the most, or what do they feel they take away from this story, if they're sharing that with you?
Well, going all the way back to the wonderful woman who was hired by the University of Nevada Press to be my copy editor, she, as we had this dialogue back and forth, and she was sending me basic corrections, spelling errors and dumb repetitions and things like that. But she also began to respond in a very emotional way to the story. Mm-hmm. And she turned out to be, I'm so grateful to say, in many ways, an ideal reader for me. Mm-hmm. And it was both of those things. It was, she really got caught up, she said, with the we can call them characters, even though they were real people, but they're characters in my book. Mm-hmm. And she liked the way the background information came in. She was very helpful in several places, helping me clarify and in a couple of cases, I moved a paragraph or two to a different location so that it served the story better. But I would say overall, I just this morning, Beth received an email from a friend in Boston she actually received the book. My son in Portland had sent the book out there, and it was that similar response. She said that this is the kind of book she likes to read, where she learns something, and it's also a story that she said she found compelling. To me, that was exactly what I wanted to hear.
All right. Well, besides the quality of the research and the power of the story itself, and in addition to your ability to make scenes out of facts that are, factually accurate, but also emotionally involving, you have another technique that you employ, I think, just beautifully in this book, and that's cutting back and forth in time. So that we will see your mother at age 22, or your father at the very end of the war, and then you cut to more contemporary times. Most of them set in Reno, and so we see this same woman who was living on sort of spoiled rice, and in a what she called a slum, before the end of the war, and before she met your father, and before life turned really a great big turn for both her and her mother. But she's placed side by side almost with these cuts. The young person, the mother in Reno in the 50s at her bridge club, in her drama group. What effect do those cuts have on you when you decided to do them, and why did you decide to do them? And how did you decide when to make them, what to place next to each other? Or did you just proceed sort of instinctively and go, now it feels like this would be an interesting time to have a Reno 1959 section?
That's a really good question. And in fact, I put a lot of effort into the structure of this story. And I have to say, in earlier drafts, I was jumping all over the timeline constantly, chapter by chapter. And very early on, I showed my son Ty a section of the narrative where it was doing that. And he gave me a great reaction. He said, no, no, no. For one thing, you want to keep your reader moving along. And there's a natural structure to this. Your story is really covering the entire 20th century. Why don't you at least frame it so that it follows the 20th century? You could go ahead and zip in and out of the timeline somewhat, but don't just do it constantly. And he was absolutely right. I modified what I was doing. I realized, yes, that is the span of the story. My grandmother was born in 1896, 4 years before the 20th century began. My mother died in 2002, 2 years after the century ended. It's this very natural structure. And in fact, the almost the exact midpoint of the century is that turning point you were just referring to in their story.
Mm-hmm.
So once I decided, all right, I'm gonna follow the century more from beginning to end, but I did feel the need to jump out and jump forward in the timeline, even beginning very early in the book. But it was always something that was thematically related to what I was talking about. There's a scene where I talk about my grandmother taking my mother to sit in the park in Shanghai when my mother was a little girl. And it was a respite from the stress of their very difficult lives. And of course, I have this vivid memory of riding the bus with my grandmother in Reno when I'm a little boy, and she loved to take me downtown and sit in the park along the river and feed the ducks in Reno. And to me, these scenes belonged close together, even though there was a 40, 50 year gap in between. So I tried really hard to structure some things like that so that they went together, so that they made sense. But overall, I moved the story along through the decades. Of course, I have a prologue that takes place almost right in the middle, and I have an epilogue that takes place only a year later, also right in the middle. So I sandwiched the story with these two scenes in the middle, but I played with that. I played with that quite a bit. I was moving things around until I finally felt satisfied that somebody would. I didn't want anybody to get lost. It's a complex story, and at the same time, I wanted to be able to leap forward in the timeline in ways that would make sense to a reader, and then they could leap back into where we left them off, say a chapter ago. And I think in a way, that's another technique that fiction writers make use of plenty, especially when you have a narrator. And in this case, I'm the narrator. But I took some liberties structurally that way, hoping that it would still hang together. And I think it was better, and I think my son was absolutely right to adjust it somewhat to follow the pace of the decades. Yeah.
Yeah, so the reader feels grounded. You see it starting to happen, that we keep, that we really are progressing through the century. And that is a kind of comfort in a way. Well, it allows you to stray more, to kind of meander seemingly to something 4 decades earlier, but we'll be coming back and moving forward. The other effect that has on me as a reader, to see a character in one phase of their life sort of placed in the book right next to the character possibly a half a century later, is that it really, I think it's a huge gift that you give everyone, but to do that, every reader, because what it does is it forbids categorization. I could walk into that drugstore when I was 12 or 10, and your grandmother had taken you there in Reno for a chocolate soda, and I would probably think, and even if I was with my mother or an adult, we would probably think, oh, she has a Russian accent. She talks funny. She seems kind of whipped up or something, how you describe her. She was kind of nervy and dramatic. It's so easy to slot people when you have just, one shard of them. And what your book does, I think, is remind all of us that we contain multitudes in terms of times that we've lived in, experiences we've had, ways that we were in the world at one age, and that may be very different from a personality or an affect that appears later on. So that I was always a little thrilled when you broke off and did this kind of back and forth, because I had to say to myself, oh, that little tiny kind of almost hysterical grandma that her grandkids are laughing at, because she's so goofy, is this woman who actually got a lot of her friends and neighbors out of Kobe, out from under the B-29 bombers, got them to a little village not so far away. I mean, just heroic, calm, strong behavior. And then you're just never able to look at another little old lady the same way again. So I think that's a huge gift that you're giving us all in this book.
Well, in the process of writing this book, I received some huge gifts. And in fact, that's a really good example right there. My grandmother's history, and particularly the part you're referring to, where she was downright heroic during the war and helping save some lives. That's nothing we learned either from my mother or my grandmother. I had to learn that by stumbling upon another memoir written by a wonderful man who was about 10 years younger than my mother, who lived through the war years in Kobe, named George Sidlin. And I have many examples of amazing discoveries I made in the process of the research, but in many ways, that's the most amazing one, because it provided me with a wealth of information. So I'll show you the book, because it's a book called Somehow We'll Survive by George Sidlin. I was scrounging around on the internet looking for more memoir material. There's a fair number of memoirs of Shanghai refugees, very little, almost none, about people who were trapped in Japan, Jewish refugees trapped in Japan. There was a small number. Well, I spotted this one. The subtitle is Life in Japan During World War II Through the Eyes of a Young Caucasian Boy. And I said, wow, I got to have that. So I ordered the book, and it actually came, it was a used copy, autographed to somebody else. And it's a self-published book. But I began reading it, and I get to about chapter 2, and suddenly George is talking about my grandmother and my mother in his book. And the name meant nothing to me. It turns out, to make a long story short, I looked up Mr. Sidlin and found him in Portland, and Beth and I and Ty actually, we passed through Portland and we visited them, and he gave me a tremendous amount of extra information that wasn't even in the book. But among other things, I discovered that my brother and I had been hauled down to San Francisco for a wedding when I was about 11 years old that I had totally forgotten about. And it was George's wedding. And George had married after about at least a 20-year period where they didn't see each other. He had married a young playmate, Simone Moiseff, who he knew, who appears in here as just a child friend. And it was George and Simone's wedding that I attended when I was 11 years old. Anyway, it was just an astonishing connection to make. And in this book is where I learned just how helpful, and as I said, actually heroic, my little grandmother had been in helping save a number of lives in Kobe. And so I, with George's permission, I mean, I didn't copy it word for word or anything, but I related some of the details and information that he provided in his book. But I'm very sad to say that a year ago, George, who was approaching 90, passed. He was the first person I knew who passed away because he contracted COVID, and it's a tremendous loss. But we've got his book, and his information is in my book. Anyway, I had more amazing discoveries and experiences, including visiting relatives. And I saw that Kelly, my cousin Marianne's daughter Kelly, I saw her name pop up here as someone who signed on. She's in Toronto. And Kelly, hi. My brother and I visited Toronto. We finally rediscovered some relatives that we had completely lost touch with. And my cousin Marianne, who grew up in Shanghai, younger than my mother, but we were able to look her up, meet her family, and I came away with a wealth of new information and some wonderful photographs from meeting those relatives. And then we're related to them, actually. Marianne reminded me very much of Helmi, of my mother. And we had a great time. That was just one of the best experiences that came out of this research process, as well as a tremendous source of information.
That's amazing. Did the two women, your mother and grandmother, who emerged as you interwove your memories with all this research, and both your mother died in her 70s, right?
Yeah, she was 78. Yes.
And your grandmother was how old?
Oh gosh, she was probably 94, coming up on 95. Yeah.
Okay, so long span of time, in her case especially. What most surprised you by your discoveries? You knew these women, they were part, they were in your household when you were growing up, including your grandmother for quite a chunk of that time. Were there any big surprises where you just really had to just kind of rearrange your head about what you had thought they were about, or what kind of people they were?
Well, the one I just cited was one of the biggest, because we grew up knowing our grandmother as really this comical figure who was also seemingly living under perpetual stress, and she turns out to have had plenty of good reasons to live under perpetual. She did live under perpetual stress. It was really, many of the surprises were just tying in things that I learned about the history with their lives. For example, I had never known that there was a tremendous earthquake in Japan in 1923, which took place in September of 23. That would be 3 months after my mother was born. And my mother was born in Japan. And it would have been right during the brief time when my grandmother was living what she thought would be a safe family life. And right up the coast from Kobe was this enormous earthquake that caused tens of thousands of lives, both the quake and the tsunami waves and the fires that consumed a huge number of lives. And I realized, she never talked about that, but I realized knowing what kind of personality she had, even when she was younger, it must have been extremely traumatic for her. And that was actually a very important event in the overall history of Japan. The Japanese were so helpless after that event, they had to beg for assistance from a number of other countries. And one of the results of that politically for Japan was this movement to gain more autonomy, to build up their own empire, to create a sense of safety and control for themselves as a nation. So on the really big scale, that was a hugely important event. And I know, and I had to extrapolate the this in, I had to really shoehorn this into the story, but I know that was one of the early traumatic events for my grandmother. It absolutely had to have been. And
Sure.
so there were discoveries on the personal level, and there were discoveries like that on the level of global history. And I was juggling all these things in the air and trying to balance them once again, balance the personal story against, the great big socio-political events of the era.
Well, I think it's another example among many that the way to get a sense of an era is so often the best way, the most powerful way is through, ordinary on the ground people living through it, rather than, policy making events or elections or, sort of the top layer of history or a certain kind of history that can seem a little desiccated sometimes, at least to me. And by sort of feeding in the lives and experiences of someone, especially someone you care about and you come from, I think it really infuses the big, grand, almost abstract story with real life and feeling. And I think that's what you've done.
So I want to be careful here. I know I'm seeing that there are about 18 people who've chimed in on the chat button down there, and and we've been kind of ignoring them, and I don't want to totally ignore them, and I don't want.
Well, I think they're saying hi on the chat, and the Q&A, there's 2 questions.
Oh, okay.
I think if you have a question, this would be the time to post it on the Q&A so that we can, so that David can answer them before our time's up, which is pretty quick.
Yeah, I know. It's been zooming by here, so to speak.
Well, let's look at one of these questions here. Helmi was a prolific reader. This is from Germaine Conrad. And your father was so creative on several fronts. What aspects do you think you inherited from your father?
Well, I didn't get to know my father as well as I wanted to. He died when I was 14. And he became ill when I was about 9. So it was a difficult 5 years of me. I was growing up. My brother was 2.5 years older. We were growing up. But I was always aware. My father was a brilliant man with all these interests in science, and he was extremely well read. He'd gone to Harvard Law School, but he spent his life working in the family hardware store because he and his 2 brothers had stepped in to help my grandfather in Reno with the family hardware business. I have to think that he would be very pleased that I did this project. One of the late discoveries was actually a packet of letters that my father wrote home to his mother in Reno during the war years, a packet of 50 letters wrapped up in a piece of pink yarn that we had never, ever seen. And I learned a great deal more about my father. He was a prolific writer of letters, and actually a very vivid and very entertaining writer when he wrote home letters to his mother in Reno. That was on the order of a revelation, just to be able to get to know this person who was he was already in his 30s. He enlisted in the war. My dad was born in 1915. So but now he was 30 by 1945. So he was in his late 20s when he enlisted. He was older than a lot of the other GIs. Anyway, I think he was more of a literary kind of person than I ever actually knew.
Mhm.
And my mother, of course, was a devourer of books. She received an award from the Washington County Library in Reno for having checked out the most books of anyone in the last 40 years or something. I can't remember. The plaque got lost. I can't remember what. Yeah, that was. I think on both sides there was definitely an interest in books and the written word.
Here's one from Doug Damon. David, I understand you were able to visit the present owner of the Dartmouth house. Is that your Reno house?
Yes.
Dartmouth house, who happens to have an interesting history in China himself. Is there anything about your visit with him in the house you grew up in that stands out? As you know, I live across the street in a house that wasn't built when you were a child.
Hi, Doug. No, I missed. I was in Reno a couple of weeks ago doing a reading, and this wonderful man, Bob Cheng, lives in my mother's old house. He wasn't able to come to the reading, and I didn't see him this time. I only happened to meet him when my cousin Danny and I were driving by the house. This is 3 years ago, and he was standing outside, and Danny flagged him down and said, "Hey, this guy here grew up in that house." And Bob invited us in. No, all I learned was that he, I believe, came from Shanghai. I don't even know what he does in Reno. There's a great deal more I want to learn. So I think Doug can fill me in. I sent Bob some photos of what the house looked like years ago. It's been really transformed. Doug, you also need to know that just this last time I happened to run into Jackie Springer in her driveway, and she invited us in, and I had a really wonderful visit. This is the other neighbor across the street who was there all the years I was growing up. She's coming up on age 92, and she's still there. And I had a wonderful visit with Jackie. But I need to get to know Bob much, much better.
How interesting, layer upon layer.
Yeah.
Is there any a page maybe that you would like to read, or just a short little excerpt that those who haven't read your book yet can get a feel for the tone of it? Would you want to do that?
Sure. Maybe a little bit from the prologue that I was talking about. So this is almost at the midpoint of the story. This is in Kobe, Japan, August 1945. On a sweltering summer day, just before noon, a petite young woman sat in a crowded streetcar that rolled along the industrial waterfront of Kobe, Japan's main international seaport. The streetcar's progress was painfully slow. Mounds of rubble were heaped all around, the result of recent American carpet bombings that had killed thousands of people and destroyed large swaths of the city. Entire blocks down near the harbor had been leveled, and to the young woman it seemed miraculous that the streetcar could even still operate. Her hair was dark, nearly black, and although Kobe was the city of her birth, she was not Japanese. Her name was Helmi Koskin, and she was Russian Jewish, part of a small community of foreigners who had survived in Japan throughout the Second World War. She was on her way to one of the waterfront black markets, where fresh fruits and vegetables, though officially unavailable, might yet be for sale. She and her mother, with whom she lived in a small boarding house that her mother managed, had subsisted mostly on rations of moldy white rice and beans for the past 4 years of war. Suddenly, the streetcar lurched to a stop in the middle of a block, and the conductor gestured impatiently for everyone to get off. Helmi joined the other passengers filing into the street. It was probably just a blockage on the tracks. No one moved with any particular urgency. Weariness and resignation were in every face. Sirens had sounded several times in recent days, but no American bombers had appeared over Kobe for over a month. Everyone understood that Japan was on its knees. Tokyo, the capital city, had been ravaged repeatedly by fire bombings, as had most of the other major cities. Word was circulating that a week ago, some kind of new bomb, one bomb dropped from a single plane, had obliterated the city of Hiroshima, only 150 miles to the east. Another, 3 days later, supposedly had done the same to Nagasaki, a bit further away. In between these horrors, the Soviet Union, fresh from fighting the Nazis, finally declared war on Japan. Would Russians soon be dropping bombs too? No one knew what to believe anymore. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Helmi looked upward at the hazy sky, wondering if it was Kobe's fate also to be wiped off the map. But there was nothing in the sky and no sound of a plane. Traffic all around had stopped, and people had congregated on the sidewalk, maintaining an odd silence. Some were gathered around a table set outside a storefront on which a large console radio had been placed. The radio suddenly crackled to life, as did the loudspeakers mounted on rickety poles that normally broadcast air raid sirens. There were no sirens now, just the crackling static, but everyone around her appeared intent on listening. Then a voice began broadcasting, tinny and peculiarly high-pitched. She strained to listen, but she could understand nothing. She had lived in Kobe long enough to learn conversational Japanese, but this voice spoke in an unfamiliar dialect. She couldn't even tell whether it was a man's voice or a woman's. People glanced at each other with shocked expressions, but no one looked at her. The voice from the speakers went on for several minutes and then abruptly stopped, and all was quiet again. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and no one moved, as if the world had been frozen. Then, slowly, people shuffled to life again on the sidewalks. Cars and trucks and bicycles started moving up the street, and passengers made their way back to the streetcar. Faces remained stunned. Hardly anyone spoke. A few had begun to weep. She overheard a word spoken in a whisper, Showa. This is what they called their emperor. Was the voice his? What in the world could he have to say? As far as she knew, he had never before addressed the populace. Had he announced new restrictions? Would there be the great invasion of the mainland that many had feared? It wasn't until later, when she finally returned home with a few meager vegetables, that she learned the news from an English-speaking Japanese neighbor. Indeed, it was the emperor, speaking directly to his people for the first time in his life. His speech had a title, The Jewel Voice Broadcast, and it had been delivered in the arcane dialect used for rare royal decrees. The message was simple. Japan had surrendered to America. I guess I could stop there.
That's wonderful. I saw that emperor in '83. I was in Tokyo, and he appeared to a crowd behind a big glass wall, and my father was a B-29 pilot, and so it layers and it layers. And I've read his journals and how he flew over the country. He was 27. He flew over the country and wrote, "Oh my God, this is like Dante's Inferno. The country is devastated." And it was sort of this feeling breaking through, of what our, carpet bombing missions had done.
Later in the book, she described to us very vividly what it was like when almost 500 B-29s would come in very low in formation at around 3,000, 3,500 feet, wing to wing. She said in the middle of the day, the sky would just turn black, and it just bombed the hell out of those cities. And their house actually survived. The house next door was destroyed. They found an incendiary bomb, one of those 2-foot bombs, sitting on the kitchen counter that had come through the roof and had not gone off. And they took in the Sidlans. They took in people right into their home there. And then they took my grandmother took a bunch of people over the hill on the one train line that was still functioning and got them out of the city. And because everyone knew there would be more of those bombings. That was all in earlier 1945. The bombings all took place, at least in Kobe, between January and June of 1945.
Yeah, in his diary, it starts out there. They seem to be targeting, or other B-29s were targeting strategic arms plants and airfields and so on. And it seemed that within a couple of months, it was just firebombing.
Yeah.
Just a terror.
They learned how to do it in the European theater and then applied it. It was more difficult in Japan because the weather wasn't very good, and the cities mostly are coastal and have mountains that come right up.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't as easy to do as it was in Germany, but they did a pretty thorough job anyway.
Well, yeah, it's amazing to read about and think about. Well, does anybody out there? I'm sure there are people in the audience who are thinking of writing some of their own family's story or investigating it at least. If anybody has here's your last chance, a question for David. You can ask it now. In any case, pick up his book, Helmi's Shadow, and you will learn how it's done when it's done really well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the Montana Book Festival for hosting this event.
Yes.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. That
Thank
was a
you,
beautiful
Lauren.
thing too, David. Yeah. So many thank yous to you both for being here again together today. And thank you to our audience for showing up and asking questions. And I want to thank, again, our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and the Trail 1033. Just as a reminder, you can purchase Helmi's Shadow at Fact and Fiction Books. Be sure to enter the code MBF at checkout, either on their website at factandfictionbooks.com, or you can vocally say the code MBF if you're buying books in the store, and 20% of those sales will come back to the festival. So thank you again, David and Dee, and thank you everyone for showing up tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Bye.
See you, David.